there is a little bit new here from when I originally saw this post, and essentially with the Lore Master, it looks like they are starting to think about a revamp, and in particular, I remember the initial post that I read seemed to be focused primarily on pets, and that was pretty much it. Lore Masters, yes, they fill the unique support role in LOTRO, in particular debuff. I think that's something that maybe could be emphasized a little bit more. That's really what the Lore Masters and Burglars do. They also have some other utility that like helps round out their support, but they're two of the more primary debuff specs in terms of support. There's also Captain, which is more on the buff end of support, for example. But here they actually talk about, yeah, support can mean different things. I definitely think that. So what the class does well, what bugs you, and what you feel might need a bit of improvement. So one of the things I like about LOTRO is that there is a support role. Like with the Lore Master, you have the option to play Yellow Line and focus on support. Same with Burglar. You have the Yellow Line Burglar, Yellow Line Lore Master. But these classes also have DPS specs. I realize, especially in the group content situation, I really need a spec red line. I don't like blue line, besides that one ability again, but it doesn't matter here. The DPS specs haven't always been the most viable. In my experience, sometimes the red line Burglar has dished out some decent damage. In certain contexts, the Lore Master, red line Lore Master has as well. But on the whole, in group content, they're going to be most valued in their support spec. That's something that I, just like with other classes that can, for example, heal, I think the support should be treated just the same, where ideally, no matter which specialization that you go into, whatever role it fills, that spec should be viable in that role. So I think that's one of the biggest things with Lore Master that I would like to see perhaps improved upon, made to be able to fill on the DPS just like any other DPS, and you wouldn't feel bad for, one, taking a red line Lore Master, and two, you wouldn't feel bad for playing red line Lore Master if you're on an LM compared to another spec such as Yellow Line. But yeah, that's just some general things that I think with the Lore Master. Hopefully they have some goals to achieve that type of thing. Okay, so the other thing that they talk about here, it looks like the next thing is about pets in general. And if y'all have seen my recent videos, I have complained a lot about pets. In particular, Lore Master pets in LOTRO. Mainly the general way that they're used and their general impact levels that they have nowadays. In fact, this actually reminds me, I had a video that I wrote maybe a month or two ago. I think the script, if you want to call it that, is basically complete at this point. It was called the Lore Master problem. It was kind of themed after my old redline Beorning problem videos, which I hope to get to another one of those this summer. Yeah, the thing with this video is it was not necessarily meant to be all negative, even though a lot of it was complaining. I actually really like the Lore Master class. I have played it a decent bit, and I enjoy it. I enjoy a lot of the ideas of it, but there's a couple particularly big things that hold it back that basically comprise this, what I call the Lore Master problem. And the two big things we just talked about, being able to viably fill the DPS role, as well as the pets, and just general use of them and that sort of stuff. So that's the idea with that video that I haven't gotten to and hopefully will release. But the other part with the Lore Master here is, do you engage with the pet rotation? I was super excited to see this because that means that Standing Stone Games is aware of the pet cycling is what I have called it, but pet rotation, it's really semantics at that point. And they are wondering if you engage with it. I think I tried once and that was it. And then if you do, how do you feel about it? I don't think it really matters, but I think a question they could ask is, if you don't, why not? Is it just don't want to or don't like the idea of it? But then also wondering if you like that it adds activity or raises skill ceiling. I actually have seen that people have commented that, you know, it's something that just makes the class a little bit more engaging. Maybe they feel like they want to have enough stuff to do otherwise. And then for me, I don't necessarily, tedious, yes. Overwhelming, not necessarily. It also stems to me not really liking Lore Master support, like playing it, just because I prefer to make things explode with fire, lightning, and frost. That's pretty much it with the Lore Master cycling. I think with pets, let's see, do you find, yes, using different pets in different circumstances, that's another area where I feel they're weak. I honestly think that ideally to me, each pet should have something unique about it, but you should never feel bad for having a particular pet out. Like, it shouldn't be maybe that big of a difference. But yeah, that's really how I think the Lore Master pet should be, is you pick a pet and use it. If you like the Bog Guardian, then you should be able to use it. And I think the really big things is the cats. The cat pets, I'm not biased or anything, but I think the cat pets should actually have a reason for existing. And right now they are, for the most part, just not very useful compared to other pets generally. But it would take a big rework of the pets to get them in what I would personally consider to be a good spot. Technically, I think that pets do actively contribute, but I don't feel like they actively contribute. I realize that's using the same words for two different meanings. The pets, I don't feel like they actively contribute. Maybe that's a better way to put it. There's just, to me, nothing really active about it. Even in pet cycling, where you just summon a pet for its debuffs, desummon it, summon another pet for its debuffs, etc. That is pretty much how pet cycling works for anybody curious, or what they call pet rotation. It's basically the same thing. It is active gameplay, but to me that wouldn't make it feel like the pets actively contribute, is how I describe it. I feel like I'm making no sense, so let's move on. Now, do you have the opportunities to use the pets you like? No, 100% not. Technically, I can, of course, use whatever pet I want, but actually feeling like it contributes somewhat meaningfully, even like a little bit meaningfully, not really. Feel like I'm either locked into a few types or statically, or in constant pet rotation. Kind of like Bella, you say that you love cat pets, but yeah, you usually use the bear for tanking. And to me, that can make a little bit of sense. It's kind of tough with the bear. I like having pets that do specific things. But if you're looking for just generally filling a role or filling DPS or just having a pet out, that's more so when I think they could be no reason to feel bad for choosing the pet that you pick. And yeah, maybe solo, there could be a little bit more reason to pick cats. Maybe they do more damage than the bear. See, that's the thing. This might make pets less meaningful in a way, but you could have, it's almost like the old WoW, where you could spec your pets. So you could choose your pet, you want it to be DPS or tanking oriented, but then that wouldn't make sense for some of them, and having that flexibility on bear could lead to issues. So I don't know. Don't have much of an idea for an ideal solution, but I certainly have thoughts on why I don't like Lore Master pets, and very strongly don't like the current way Lore Master pets work. You know, some ideas. But yeah, that's the thing. When I perhaps talk about, and maybe more in a critical sense, talk about things that they have in LOTRO that I don't like, there are so many factors that go on in things like revamping Lore Master pets. What about people that maybe do like pet cycling? What about people that maybe think each pet should have a distinctive role and there should always be a best one for a particular situation? People, as crazy as it is, different people have different opinions and different thoughts, basically. So as a game designer, the developers of LOTRO essentially have to take all that into account. Oh, it's actually more about pets. So they're eyeing some pet things, and some of the ideas that they have is pet summoning cooldown. I think that could greatly improve the pet cycling issue. But let's see, why contain it? You said that some games do choices like that as trait choices, so you can find a trait that makes the pet same or make pet cycling good. Yeah, that is something that could give you the option to choose how you want your Lore Master pets to work. That would be tough to balance, but an entire possibility of something they could do. That way, for somebody like me, who, mind you, doesn't even play Yellow Line Lore Master, but just very much so dislikes the idea of pet cycling, I could be perfectly fine not pet cycling, while some people who like it could choose to do that. Like, I made 2 cat beds, so they no longer have to fight over this one. And yeah, that's actually a really great idea, I think, Jim, about a way to tackle blue is make pet selection, and make pet selection important, is to make certain skills have additional effects based on the pet you have summoned. I think that could be a really interesting way to do it. So yeah, that looks like just one idea that they're having to do it, kind of like the captain pets. I think they could do better than that, but as something that would work to change pet cycling to not really be as much of a thing anymore, and some of the other issues with it that aren't necessarily just pet cycling. But I don't know if it's as far as like a full pet revamp to make pets, to me at least, a way that I actually like the way Lore Master pets work in game. I don't think that's quite, I hate to say the word enough, like I'm just saying more for the revamp. To get the class pets or whatever it is spec in line of my ideal envision for it would be, at least, is it would require additional work essentially. And I did talk about generally, like Lore Master has high impact, long cooldown abilities, and then also some slower built up damage over time type abilities, especially with the Burning Embers, Gust of Wind mechanic. And that's pretty much it. When they say that your skills can feel quite thin, that is exactly where I feel like one kind of core rotational type ability, not necessarily changing an ability we have. Lore Master has a lot of skill bloat, but maybe repurposing one of these abilities or somehow making it so you just have one more short cooldown, fairly snappy downtime type core ability, I think could be a great change to the Redline Lore Master. And I think for me, make the spec a little bit more enjoyable, and in particular, make it feel less thin, despite having all these explosive abilities. When those are all on cooldown, that's where I feel like the Redline Lore Master can start to feel a bit thin, and perhaps that could be an improvement. Let's see about current damage potential. I've already touched a little bit on this, but the contrast and uniqueness of having your damage be some slowly built up over time, but then having the very high damage, high impact, but long cooldown abilities is pretty neat. What frustrates you when trying to prioritize DPS? I think mainly, for me, if I were to take a Lore Master to end game, it just seems like in most situations, a Yellow Line Lore Master would just be straight up better. So to me, that is the biggest thing there, as well as the pet cycling and maybe even emphasis on debuffs. I don't mind as a DPS Lore Master. I mean, it's a support class, so maybe having some support, maybe having some debuffs baked in along with your damage could be a neat thing. Maybe the like new core rotational ability idea that I gave, maybe that one could play a debuff theme somehow, but be more DPS oriented. That could be interesting. Yeah, this sticky tar, I'm not the best about always using this, but it decreases enemy fire mitigation. And then also Catmint Raven would be another thing to look out for. It's been a while since I've done anything with this because my main Lore Master here is level 66. I haven't played my high level Lore Masters for, I think I have 2 of them, for a long while. Partially because of some issues in general with the class and specs of them, so maybe improvements would change that for me. I haven't found myself running into that situation too much, but that's where I think the thinness comes in, and yes, waiting on cooldowns, but not necessarily these very high impact cooldowns, but just wanting something. This is why I keep leaning on the new skill aspect, leaning on something added to the core rotation outside of these high cooldown abilities. I didn't mean to me just answering these questions, but that's almost the way it worked out. Hopefully this gives you all ideas, and of course any thoughts you have on these questions, feel free to share, obviously in the comments, but also on the LOTRO forums, the original post of this. But yeah, I think the really big things with DPS oriented Lore Master is, one, just to repeat myself, make them viable, and no reason you should feel bad for choosing to DPS Lore Master instead of support Lore Master. And also make sure it's the other way around too, where you shouldn't feel bad for wanting to support Lore Master instead of DPS Lore Master. And also general changes to pets, so you can more or less pick which pet you want, and they'll help you do DPS and maybe give a little bit of group support effect, but nothing that makes you rely on a very specific pet. You can again just choose which one you want, and then perhaps rework abilities a little bit so that outside of the high cooldown abilities, there's just something a little bit more than just Burning Embers, Gust of Wind, Lightning Strike, and to an extent, Cracked Earth. That is my attempt at a quick summary of that. But moving on from there then, Yellow Line Lore Master. I don't really play Yellow Line Lore Master, and it is true, this is something that I don't think a great thing, as I have talked about in previous videos. It is primary trait setup because it's a support focused one, and Lore Masters have been support class, and historically in LOTRO, the developers have basically, I don't know if decided is the right word, but balanced the classes such that typically one primary role of them is the only viable one, which is usually linked to one specific specialization. So it looks like they're considering some changes with that. Primary is thought off in raid groups instances in PvP. Doesn't mean has no room for improvement. I do agree. I personally don't really enjoy Yellow Line Lore Master, so it'd have to have a lot of changes probably for me to enjoy it. So I'm not really the person to probably comment on this type of thing. For anybody that does play LM Lore Master, I'd be interested to what you think though. What do you think could be improved to make it better? I am curious though still with the questions I have in case I have any general thoughts on it. I think the big thing that I wish was different was no pet cycling. That would make me more likely to approach Yellow and Lore Master. Okay, this is something I have run into. I will say I have seen people comment on this one quite frequently, even people I play LOTRO with somewhat frequently, is that they just feel like their class is totally useless when there's no crowd control component or ads are not crowd controllable. So that is something I've run into, and maybe something they could consider as, you know, I don't know if these are the type of people that would actually share their thoughts on it, but it is something they have discussed. They just don't feel as useful when there is no option for them to use their crowd control abilities. And then let's see, just an update, not planning to remove support role or identity. I think that's a great thing. As much as I would like them to make DPS just viable and give you reason to play DPS Lore Master in all endgame contexts, even most difficult tier 5 raids, etc. I think that they should still have the support role and identity in the class. A lot of people do enjoy playing it as a support class, which is great. Just because I personally don't doesn't mean it's a bad thing that it exists. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I of course love that people love it, especially when they play in a group with me, because that means we're helped out by all the great Lore Master support stuff. But yeah, that's some general thoughts I have on upcoming potential changes. Sounds like Lore Master revamp might be in the works down the ways. As far as traits go, that actually is something I honestly don't feel like any particular trait is unexciting. Perhaps the biggest one is like the avoidance debuffs in Ring of Fire. That seems more or less pointless. I wouldn't mind seeing that be either removed or changed to something else. Maybe that is one of those things though, that if you're a Redline Lore Master, maybe Ring of Fire is type of ability that could have some AoE support that is not a small BPE debuff. Maybe it could be something like increased incoming damage. I actually do think Fierce Lightning, this connects back to some of the Guardian traits that we were talking about, having to spend 5 points to get that to be 100% chance trigger. I would prefer any trait like that in game, where it's like a slow build up of percent chance to be either something else or just be 1 point, and it's like 1 point in this and there you go. You're guaranteed to get the Fierce Lightning. I don't know if I can express this enough, but I really love the long cooldown strong abilities. Lightning Storm is no exception. Yeah, I actually agree. The staff Sword and Storm here for Staff Strike, the 1 minute cooldown that it can call lightning down on your foe, dealing damage. I don't know if it's significant, but stunning the foe, I think that could also be shortened. I definitely agree. Maybe I also feel like I never quite want to pick Fend Them Off because it's a 1 minute cooldown. You can boost your damage by 12% and get the avoidances, but focusing on the damage buff, that's something that just on a 1 minute cooldown, if I remember correctly, the duration isn't really impressive where you'd actually want to get that. That is something I agree that could be reworked. Maybe shorter cooldown, longer duration of the buff type thing. I really feel like the biggest thing with Lore Master that is perhaps not touched on all too much in this, they kind of brushed it to the side to focus a little bit more on Lore Master's damage roll in general. And my interpretation of that, I think they might even have mentioned it, was the red line. Okay, so this was just general Lore Master DPS. They didn't really specify red line, but it seemed to imply red line because that's where a lot of Lore Master's DPS is. The blue line. To me, that is the spec that needs the most like overhaul, rework, total ground up, destroy it for the most part. Maybe preserve a couple things like Murder of Crows, and outside of a Murder of Crows, just delete everything and think about it from the start. You could end up with traits that you have now, like decreased skill inductions or whatever. Just totally start fresh with trying to design a new blue line. I think could be a good place to start with that. Yeah, to me, blue line, that just needs the really big overhaul and could be turned into a support specialization, as in supplemental traits for red and yellow line Lore Master build, and maybe focuses still on the pets and how they work with your red and yellow line LMs. That's a possibility. This is one of the ones that I would be, of all the specs for the different classes they could do this to, this is one I'd probably be a little bit more sad about, because I think it could be great to have an actually viable pet-focused Lore Master spec that, like I said, the red line, you should have no reason to feel bad about picking a red line Lore Master over wanting to play a yellow one. I think blue line could be the same. No reason to feel bad about wanting to play blue line over red line over yellow line. In an ideal world, all be viable for their role. That's actually a whole other conversation, is the for their role and what roles fit where and what type of content needs what roles. But I'll just put the idea forward if anybody wants to comment on it, and maybe we can talk about it more at a later time if people are interested. In LOTRO, there are 4, and depending how you even define it, maybe 5 primary roles in the game. You have the classic DPS, somebody who does damage. You have the classic healer, somebody who heals allies. You have the classic tank, somebody who tanks mobs. And then you have the support role. So that's the 4th role. You have the Lore Master and Burglar, which have some general utility, as well as a big focus on debuff support. But you also have the Captain, which focuses more on buff support, but it's still technically support, just different support. And then there are some, so that would be 5 if you split buff support and debuff support into 2 different ones. The debuff supports also have more crowd control in general with Lore Master and Yellow Line Burglar, Yellow Line Lore Master as well. Even things like, this is where it gets really complicated, but you have things like Beorning, which is a healer, Yellow Line Beorning, which is a healer, but also has some support stuff with debuffs. Pretty much pure DPS. Champions technically have some debuffs, even though that's not their focus. Hunters as well. So there are a lot of classes that have a tiny bit of support baked into them, but then you have the Lore Master, Burglar, which really focus on the debuff support, and Captain, which focuses on the buff support. Brawler also has a lot of buff support, by the way. Can't forget them, as much as I like to apparently pretend they're not a class just because I forget about them. They do actually exist, believe it or not. Yeah, that's just something to think about. How do all the roles really fit in LOTRO? And what I was really getting to was content. In a 3-man instance, should the optimal setup or almost minimum requirement be maybe you have 2 different roles and otherwise you can fill it how you want? Do you want to have okay, maybe you have a tank, but then you can have a healer or support to go along with the tank, and then maybe just one of whatever. There's a lot of flexibility there, and it really depends how they design the roles, balance the content, and balance the individual specs of the classes. And in a 6-man, is it ideal that you have one of each role? So you have a DPS, have at least 1 DPS, at least 1 tank, at least 1 healer, and at least 1 support. Maybe you could have that 1 support be at least 1 debuff support. So you always, in an ideal 6-man group, want to have a Yellow Line Burglar or a Lore Master, any of the DPSs, any of the tanks, any of the healers? Or do you maybe only want that to be a requirement, kind of a soft requirement, more that it's just whatever it's balanced around, to be in a raid? And then the other part of that, the other factor where I guess the Lore Master and revamp comes in, is if you're in one of these 6-man instances and you have 5 spots filled up and your last spot is for a debuffer, if a Lore Master wants to join that group, they're probably going to be more or less forced into the Yellow Line, but that's because that's what the group needs. If they had 2 slots left, I think there should be no reason that you couldn't take 2 Lore Masters, 1 Yellow Line Lore Master that focuses on support, 1 Red Line Lore Master that focuses on damage. So I think that's just something that Standing Stone Games has to consider for ideal group balance. And this is my tired 10 o'clock rambling grand revelations of why group balance and composition and making Red Line Lore Master viable is very complicated. And with that note, it is best that I stop.